Perfect. I think we're all settled and we can start the panel. Good morning to you all and buongiorno. Welcome to the panel session hosted by the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, where we will present to you two new tools that the office has recently developed, the Safety of Journalists Toolbox and the Guidelines for Monitoring Online Violence Against Female Journalists. As the panel title suggests, the first tool, the Safety of Journalists Toolbox, aims at strengthening the safety of journalists and media freedom through good practices and accountability measures. And the second tool, the Guidelines for Monitoring Online Violence Against Female Journalists, aims to better protect women journalists and to prevent online violence escalation by providing a systematic monitoring and reporting system for preventing online gender-based violence against female journalists from a gender-responsive and gender-sensitive approach. Now, these two new tools have been developed in response to the emerging challenges and the new challenges that the journalists face, unfortunately, today. No matter the circumstance, whether in times of peace or in times of crises, online or offline, unfortunately, we know that journalism continues to be a dangerous profession. So we hope with these tools that we will strengthen their safety condition. Our panel will last for around 50 minutes or so. It will be divided into two parts. The first part will be dedicated to the interventions by our esteemed speakers here, who will provide some insights for around 10 minutes or so. And then the remaining time will be dedicated to you, the audience, for a Q&A session. And we hope to have some free-flowing discussion. So I take this opportunity to encourage you to think of some questions and insights that you would like to share during that time. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce the speakers to you. To my left, we have Renate Schroeder, the director of the European Federation of Journalists, who has been also involved in the toolbox activities, and also our esteemed long-term partner, Julie Posetti, the Vice President of Global Research at the International Center for Journalists, who is the lead and the author of the monitoring guidelines. I am Sejla Jusufovic, the Assistant Research Officer working with the Office of the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media, and today I will be the moderator of the panel, but also I will provide a brief intervention on behalf of the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media, Teresa Ribeiro, who unfortunately could not be here today with us. Before I give the floor to our two speakers here, I will provide you a bit of information on the role and the mandate of the representative on freedom of the media and the background on these tools that we have developed. Now, the representative on freedom of the media was established in 1997, so almost 27 years ago. It was a decision made by consensus by all the 57 OSCE participating states, including Italy, who is a participating state. The representative is mandated to do two things. The first is to observe media freedom developments in all the 57 OSCE participating states as part of an early warning function. And the second is to assist the participating states in fulfilling their OSCE commitments on media freedom and freedom of expression. Now, on this basis, the representative addresses serious problems to issues related to obstruction of media activities, but also unfavorable working conditions for journalists and other media workers, and also addresses serious non-compliance with the OSCE commitments on media freedom and freedom of expression. And this is done both through silent and public diplomacy in direct contact with the authorities, and that is an important, unique element of the mandate of the representative, this direct contact that the representative has, in addition to having also, of course, close networks and partnerships with the media and other stakeholders, including civil society and academia. Another element of the uniqueness of the mandate is that it is embedded in a security organization. The OSCE, as it stands, the Organization for Security and Cooperation, is a security organization, and all the decisions and commitments are non-legally binding. Nonetheless, they have authority because they have been approved, let's say, by consensus by all the participating states. So all of them have voluntarily agreed to adhere to certain pledges and commitments. The IFRoM's work focuses on a comprehensive set of trends, persisting trends and issues that have been observed in relation to media freedom. And safety of journalists, unfortunately, remains a persisting issue, and it is the first and top priority of the representative on freedom of the media. The representative has been working extensively in this regard to enhance the safety conditions for journalists online and offline, and to advocate for an enabling environment where journalists can work freely without fear of reprisals or intimidation. And that is why in 2022, the representative decided to launch a new project called the Safety of Journalists Project in an effort to assist the participating states to further the commitments outlined in the Ministerial Council decision on safety of journalists. This decision is an important commitment, quite a groundbreaking commitment that the participating states have committed to and pledged to ensure that safety of journalists is a precondition for media freedom. And hence it was an important political signal in this regard. So the project was launched to take stock of what the participating states have done so far to implement the commitments outlined in this important document and provide assistance on how to further this. And the project focuses on the various aspects of safety of journalists, so not only the physical aspects, but also the legal, the digital safety, international perspectives, the situation of journalists in conflict and in exile, data collection and monitoring, which is an important part as well, and police prevention and fight against impunity, and also the working conditions. Of course, economic safety is also an important part of this. And the key outcome of this project is the toolbox that we're presenting to you today. The toolbox is a practical instrument showcasing national and international measures and instruments and initiatives to enhance the safety across the OSCE region, but also provides concrete recommendations on ways forward. The toolbox embodies a multi-stakeholder approach. It is meant not only to guide the participating states on how to better implement the commitments that they have adhered to, and possibly develop national action plans and other measures, but also provide important resources to other stakeholders, such as the media and the civil society. And this tool it's not a static tool, of course, because we are envisaging that there will be more developments to come in the future, so we will be constantly updating this tool in response to the future developments. And today we aim to further expand the usability of this toolbox across the different stakeholders. And I would like to encourage you all to take a snapshot of the QR code. Here we have it on our table. The QR code of the toolbox, but also of the monitoring guidelines. And yes, so please come after the session to take a snapshot of this and download it on your devices and explore the resources. I think that they will be quite useful. We have provided a link on the program website, so for those who are also following us online, I know the session is live streamed, so please go ahead and check it out. The toolbox builds on previous long-standing work of the representative on the safety topic of journalists, including the safety of female journalists online, that was launched in 2015. And since then, the representative has been conducting a series of capacity development initiatives, advocacy efforts, and various awareness-raising activities in an effort to address the distinct risks that women journalists face, unfortunately, and the consequences this can have on their profession and their participation in public discourse. Now, we know despite increased awareness and the efforts by the government, but also, of course, a lot has been done by the civil society and the media stakeholders, is that still, unfortunately, women journalists face increasing threats, and more so in the online sphere. To address this issue, and in an effort to further enhance the monitoring efforts, as we know, monitoring is an important preventative tool, the representative has commissioned the guidelines for monitoring online violence against female journalists in this regard, and this guidelines was launched last October. The tool offers practical directions and insightful preventative strategies and methods to monitor, analyze, record, and report cases of attacks, and also to deter the potential escalation to offline harm. I will not delve much into this because, of course, we have our Julie Posetti here, the author of this, and will provide further details on the guidelines. But before I give the floor to Julie, I would like to welcome Renate and give the floor to her to set the scene for us a bit on and give us an overview of the persisting and challenges that journalists face. And now a question to you in this regard, Renate. We know there are many old and interlocking challenges and critical gaps that still need to be fulfilled for journalists to be able to work safely. The European Federation of Journalists has been monitoring the safety of journalists for several years now, as we know. What are the observations from your side regarding the key persisting and new challenges that you have observed that journalists face today, and what good national and regional practices and measures have been put in place? And could you please give us some examples from the European context? Thank you.
Thank you, Sejla. Thank you very much to the OSCE for being here. Very happy to be in Perugia. Very happy to see so many people, specifically women, no surprise, unfortunately. Just before I respond to your questions, 2 words about the European Federation of Journalists, which probably quite a few of you do not know. We are the umbrella federation of journalist unions and associations. We have members in all EU and Council of Europe member states, but Belarus and Russia, both organizations working from exile. We advocate for journalism as a public good, and thus an enabling environment in which indeed journalists can do what they are best at without being attacked, without being harassed, yes, without being murdered. Unfortunately, today the public sphere is becoming increasingly polarized and, yes, dangerous for journalists and human rights defenders. So what are the key persisting challenges? The latest report by the partners of the Council of Europe Safety of Journalism platform, which is called Press Freedom in Europe, Time to Turn the Tide, is based on all the alerts which had been registered on the platform throughout 23 by journalist organizations, including the EFJ, by media freedom organizations, and the European Broadcasting Union. The report, I believe, is an excellent annual assessment which also includes recommendations for Council of Europe member states and some good practice I will elaborate on shortly. Just as a background, the Council of Europe Safety of Journalists platform, which I think it's an excellent monitoring tool, was launched in 2015 with the aim to post alerts when there are attacks against journalists, against media outlets, and against media freedom. The alerts must be verified by all the partner organizations, we are 15 by now, and the Council of Europe Secretariat. They will be sent to the respective governments who are expected to react and solve the situation. Unfortunately, there has been a downward trend regarding the responses. While in the first year there were over 50% alerts being responded by the governments, not always constructively, but at least there was a response, it had been reduced only to 39% in 22. With a bit of pressure, we are back to 46% in 23. And this for us is an important reason why we are continuing to put these alerts on the platform. It's a lot of work, you can imagine. The alerts published, they show a growing diversity of threats, including increased state surveillance, SLAPs, strategic lawsuits against public participation, I guess you all know it. The cases lawsuits, they also include defamation, ever more active criminal organizations, not only the mafia in Italy or many more mafias throughout Europe, as well as media bashing by politicians against journalists, and including more restrictive legislation. Threats and intimidation of all kinds, especially online, including death threats and female online harassment, Julie will further outline this, are now part of the new normal. The freedom to report on national security matters was indeed a prominent issue in 2023, and many investigative journalists in Perugia, you know better than me what that means. Journalists have been more often summoned or raided by state security agencies and detained and arrested under charges of terrorism, of extremism, even in Western Europe, such as in France or in Finland. The unprecedented, unlawful use of spyware against journalists throughout the world is for all of us a very serious concern. By the end of 23, and I want to repeat that, there are still 30 cases of impunity for murder concerning 49 killed media workers active on the platform. This means still a glooming reminder of a lack of rule of law and respect for press freedom. War certainly remained a threat to press freedom, with 2 journalists killed in the Ukraine and several journalists being injured. Russia, still being monitored by the platform, though it had left the Council of Europe, faced close to 15% of all the alerts, with many journalists being in prison. Russia's state repressive machine was also felt by Russian journalists in exile, who are routinely tracked and harassed online. Not to forget Belarus, where there are still 34 journalists in prison, and many journalists in exile face problems as they are categorized as foreign agents and have problems with their visa now. With regard to the important and, yes, resourceful exercise of monitoring, the EFJ, together with the International Press Institute and the European Center for Press and Media Freedom, based in Leipzig, also monitors attacks against media and journalists under the so-called MFRR, meaning Media Freedom Rapid Response. This has the financial support of the European Commission and has been also very useful to convince the EU and member states that it is high time to better protect journalists. According to the latest MFRR in the EU, the last year, the main source of attacks remained private individuals, almost 33% of the cases, followed by public officials, 18, which is quite concerning, and police and state security, 12.6%. 26% of all incidents in the EU involved some kind of physical attack. A considerable number of incidents included cases involving attacks to property, about 17%, and censorship, almost 16%. Within member states of the EU, verbal attacks represented the largest amount of alerts, whereas in applicant countries, it was legal incidents. Asking me about new threats, you mentioned the social and economic security for journalists, which in particular for freelancers is indeed a blooming a threat for a new threat for, no, it's not a new threat actually, it's been a long time threat, but it's now classified for the first time last year in the Council of Europe report as a new threat. It includes artificial intelligence, it includes the impact of social networks, disinformation. We have a lot of that, I think, during the upcoming days, and the repression of coverage of climate change or environmental-related events. Under the MFR, new threats identified are so-called DDoS. I don't know if anybody knows about that. It's called Distributed Denial of Services, and they have become very prominent in Hungary and other countries in Europe. Unfortunately, the number of such cases doubled compared to the previous year, with 61 alerts targeting 112 persons or entities related to the media. I could go on and on, but we don't have much time, so I will be a bit more positive in the last part of my presentation and give you some positive outcome of all this monitoring and some good practices actually, which is being done at national level. Just before saying that, a few weeks ago, for the first time, we funded private protection via the MFR project. This is not positive because it shows how urgent the situation is, but at least we reacted actually to a Serbian journalist and leader of the Association of the Independent Journalists of Vojvodina, Dinko Gruhonoc in Novi Sad, who had been targeted by serious death threats for a month, which culminated in death threats written in graffiti on the wall of his private residence. And he got really scared, and at least now he gets some private security because the state has not done anything. What has been positive on a general mode, that there has been a considerable reduction when it comes to alerts related to police violence against journalists during protests. Not only because we do not have the COVID-related protests anymore, it is also partly due to our advocacy with state authorities and the adoption of measures in countries such as Austria, the Netherlands, Germany, and France, improving law enforcement practices, improving training with the police and protocols. What has also been positive, in 23, there have been various positive initiatives taken which testified to a growing awareness by governments of the threat to democracy, like SLAP. Of course, significant was the adoption, the directive against SLAPs by the European Commission. It's not all perfect, but for the first time there is a directive at EU level. The Council of Europe last week adopted a recommendation also for the to not use slaps against journalists. This is actually an excellent tool. It's only a recommendation. It's soft law, but as you say, it should remind member states of what they're not doing. There had also been some slaps measures at national level, like in the UK. Positive, and I will not go into detail here, is also the adoption of the European Media Freedom Act in the EU, partly dealing with protection of sources, spyware, and other tools to enable journalists' environment. In terms of national action plans, which the tool is also collecting, there has been a national action plan for the safety of journalists adopted in October last year in the UK, also in April last year in Switzerland, which draws in consultation with media employers and journalist organizations, will focus to improve physical protection, to enhance the protection against online threats, to increase the recognition on slaps and the role of journalists. The so-called Persvelig project in the Netherlands is still a leading example of a national safety plan which has served as a model for others, where the police and the prosecutors and the journalist unions work very closely together to help journalists, to also install a helpline for journalists to protect them. And Persvelig has been adopted in other countries, just recently in the Flemish part of Belgium, but other countries are following there. In Sweden, the amendment to the criminal code gave enhanced protection to journalists under the criminal law. Lithuania just also announced an action plan for the protection, safety, and empowerment of journalists. Italy has had a sort of monitoring system since 2017, which also includes police, prosecutors, and the national unions, and the reports are now also available in English. There is more. All the national action plans can or should be found in the journalist toolbox of the OSCE, and we are, by the way, very grateful for the work of the OSCE to put that together into a toolbox. It's very important for us. We could not agree more with Teresa, who unfortunately is not with us today, that there cannot be security without media freedom, and there must be security for journalists to have media freedom. To turn the tide, we need much more political will, but we also need civic courage. We need the support from all civil society organizations and recognition that journalism is a public good. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Renate, for this very comprehensive overview of quite a bleak situation for safety of journalists. But still there is hope, what you've mentioned, the many national practices that have been recently developed. So that is a positive sign, and I hope that that will be replicated in other countries. Now I'll turn to Julie Posetti.
Excuse me, do you hear me?
Yes.
I just have a small technical question. Is it any chance to share all these numbers and data you've mentioned on the large screen behind you? It would be very helpful.
Could try
Thank you.
to get the Council of Europe platform.
We'll try that. Thank you. Yes, so I turn to Julie Posetti. Julie, we know that a pluralistic media landscape, both online and offline, can only be achieved through the active participation of diverse voices, including those of female journalists. Yet there seems to be an increasing rollback on the rights of female journalists and their participation in public discourse. This worrying trend is unfortunately, can be, as we see, is attributed to the growing gender-based violence that is occurring online. And we know from your recent research that there is a correlation between online violence and offline violence, the potential escalation to offline harms by online violence. What type of escalation prevention and redress measures do you think should be put in place to protect women journalists from these harms, and how can the monitoring guidelines aid the key responders in this endeavor? Thank you.
Thanks, Sejla. Please bear with me, I'm not well. I will do my best not to cough my way through this discussion. Yes, recently we have published, recently, over the past 4 years or so, the International Centre for Journalists, in collaboration with a team of global researchers, and particularly in collaboration with the University of Sheffield, and my colleague from there, Diana Maynard, is with us today. We have produced a study for UNESCO called The Chilling, which certainly found from a survey of over 700 women journalists that there is significant potential for online violence to escalate to offline harm. In fact, now we really think of this as a vicious cycle of online to offline violence, which, when it does manifest physically, also tends to escalate the online repression that women journalists experience. So back to that survey that was conducted at the end of 2020, we found that 20% of the women journalists surveyed said they had experienced offline harm, so abuse, attacks, harassment, which they attributed to the online violence that they had experienced. In other words, the digital threats that women journalists face in particular create an enabling environment for the kinds of harms that you've just heard Renate outline. And so what's really important then to think about is how online threats, particularly against women journalists, and we're focused on women journalists partly because of the OSCE's important leading role in highlighting the specific gender-based threats that women journalists face, but also because women tend to face greater threats online than men. And the kinds of threats they face are not just increased in volume, but they are also exceptionally sexualized. So there are additional threats, and the threats that have impacts that tend to be more significant as well. And so the study that we did for UNESCO, which was published over the course of 2 or 3 years, the outputs from it, with the final big study being published at the end of 2022, had among its recommendations the need to improve monitoring of online violence against women journalists, recognising that monitoring is an essential part of detecting the sorts of risks and threats that Renate highlighted, but also serves a function to prevent. So monitoring to detect and monitoring to prevent the escalation of online threats to offline harm. And in the context of that work, we also pointed to what we had learned from what we refer to as big data case studies, which were focused on 2 emblematic cases of women journalists, Maria Ressa in the Philippines and Carol Cadwallader, an investigative reporter based in the UK. Maria, of course, went on to win Nobel Peace Prize, in part in recognition for her fight against online harm through disinformation and gender-based online violence, to name just two of the issues that she was recognised for. What we saw with the accumulated analysis of over 2.5 million social media posts in those combined cases was the presence of what we now refer to as indicators for online violence escalation. So we're able to see in the data how the threats correlate with the kind of offline harm. And we took from the case of Maria Ressa, for example, one very concrete example, which we have used to better inform our understanding of how these threats manifest more broadly. And that was a Facebook post in 2017, which involved a person who was known at the time to be affiliated with the Duterte regime, who was traveling with the former president of the Philippines, who published on Facebook the hashtag Arrest Maria Ressa and falsely accused her of committing cyber libel, among other crimes. She, of course, was then persecuted, ultimately prosecuted and convicted of the crime of cyber libel. She continues, despite popular misconception, to have to battle 3 ongoing legal cases, including this criminal conviction, which involves jail time. Now, a significant jail time. Now, after we identified these patterns in the data, we recommended the development of what we were referring to as an early warning system, so that we could integrate these data-based insights into the threats that women journalists face online into the kinds of mechanisms that Renate has spoken about. It's a big missing piece of the monitoring puzzle, the online harms. And I should highlight, as the very many women journalists we have studied have done as well, that this enabling environment is facilitated by big tech companies. And it's done so in a way which involves the failure of those big tech companies to take responsibility for the problem, to prevent the issues, but also, believe it or not, to allow us to study what's happening and to be able to analyse in real time what's happening by limiting our access to the data sets that we need to draw the conclusions that we are around the alerts. So let's move quickly now to how this relates to this book, which we published in November last year with the OSCE, and that is the development of 15 online violence escalation indicators that we derived from 8 big data case studies, which we've done now in multiple countries focused on emblematic cases. And we have developed these guidelines through a combination of consultations and data-based research. And those indicators have, in this publication, accompanied guidance for the implementation of monitoring connected to those indicators. So one of the things we found is that there is a lack of gender-responsive, gender-sensitive approach and also monitoring guidance with reference to the sorts of threats that journalists face. There is also a parallel need for digital literacy and data analysis skills within civil society organisations and even intergovernmental organisations doing the monitoring. And as I've alluded to, there is a great need for guaranteed, free, real-time access to the APIs of the social media platforms and other technologies that journalists use to communicate with their sources, in an open sense, and to distribute their content, which makes them targets for the kinds of harassment and abuse that we have described. And so among the 15 indicators are some fairly obvious ones, such as death and rape threats. But there are also indicators that include reference to impunity cases, for example. So journalists being targeted, particularly women journalists being targeted and threatened with reference to cases involving the murder with impunity of journalists. So journalists being targeted by actors who are, for example, referring to the Daphne Caruana Galizia case, which was the horrific car bombing assassination of a vital voice, an investigative reporter in Malta. at the end of 2017. So there are a range of different indicators which are captured in this booklet, which are associated with the kinds of guidance necessary to both monitor and then escalate according to the kinds of interventions required based on the sorts of threats that women journalists are facing. The other thing that we have done is to develop an abuse typology. So we've described the various kinds of threats and categorised those and provided examples of those with reference to specific cases involving the targeting of women journalists online. And additionally, we have mapped those violations against recognised international mechanisms such as the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which include a violation known as 16.10.1, which pertains to freedom of expression. Additionally, the international criminal codes that can be used potentially in reference to prosecution for online crimes. We've mapped cases against these codes. So the idea is to help journalists, to help civil society organisations, news organisations, intergovernmental organisations understand in more detail what these threats look like and to respond according to the existing mechanisms, but with the imperative that there needs to be more systematic monitoring of online threats to women journalists, and that needs to be integrated into a holistic monitoring program, and acknowledging as well the vital function that large data sets can play in creating alerts that can then be responded to, hopefully, rapidly. And to that end, we at the International Centre for Journalists, in collaboration with our University of Sheffield computer science colleagues, are developing an online violence alert and response system, and we're grateful to have funding from the UK government and Luminate to continue that work, which includes the development of a monitoring dashboard which will produce reports which we hope to align with the OSCE guidelines. So I think I'll stop talking there. I think we've talked enough. And with regard to the request for access to data on the screen behind, what I have is a book here, several copies freely available online, which you can delve into. Over to you, Sejla.
Thank you very much, Julie, again for this insightful overview of the situation of female journalists online, but also the efforts that are put into addressing the issue of safety of journalists and the online gender-based violence that they are facing, unfortunately, increasingly in the online sphere. And as you mentioned, the importance to detect and prevent this phenomena. And I hope you will take the time to, again, I have to remind you, download the code here and take a look into this booklet. I will pass the floor now to Renate.
No, yes, only shortly. You see the mapping media freedom there, and we scroll it below. There is a way when you, as a journalist, feel attacked in whatever way, you can report it. And it's true, we have had so often the feeling that journalists feel it's part of their profession to be attacked. It's a norm. And women, it's a double point, even more. When there are the worst online or whatever harassments they could face, they think, yes, because I'm a female journalist. No, this is a big no. That's why, and it's slowly getting better. People dare to talk, and there is awareness raising. And unfortunately, you see that Great Britain is not part of this European mapping anymore, so even more important, we cooperate. And of course, the OSCE is at a larger scale, but if you have a closer look there, you see how we work. If you could just go with the Council of Europe platform again, there it's also worth looking at because they did, I think, amazing work in terms of charts on all the different categories there are, on the governments who responded, on the solved cases, not many, but yeah, this is still the media mapping freedom. Anyway, it's worth having a look at it. And for us, because as I said, and you know it, it's a lot of work. We are very small federations. We don't have many resources. Fortunately, the mapping freedom, we get resources from the European Commission. We don't know for how long. So we also have to think about future funding, how to keep this important monitoring doing, be it with the help of universities or other institutes, maybe not the ones of the platforms.
Thank you very much to both of you, Renate and Julie. Excuse me. Now we have, I think, yes, 10 minutes more for you to pose some questions and provide any insights on the topic at hand. I see a hand there. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Hannah Storm. I'm a media consultant in safety and mental health. Question for you, Julie. We've got a big year coming up with elections in a lot of places around the world. I'm curious to see, are you seeing any trends about the role of AI in online harassment? One question. And the second related is, your report spoke a lot about the mental health impact on women journalists, and I'm just wondering if you could remind us of the recommendations on that, please.
Sure. In fact, one of the indicators for online violence escalation pertains to psychological injury, and we're very much of the view that psychological harm needs to be viewed as a significant harm, as not something that can be dismissed because it is somehow invisible, in the same way that online violence was deemed for many years not to be real because it was happening in a digital realm. These worlds and these conditions are intertwined. And certainly in the context of this super year for elections and democratic erosion, where we see a global tilt towards authoritarianism, the threats to women per se, women in public life, are really exemplified in the targeted attacks on women journalists. It's literally first they come for the women journalists in the context of political transformation of a really dangerous kind, which is what we're seeing at the moment. So the intersection of misogyny and threats to press freedom is very significant. The ways in which threats to safety involve the weaponization of misogyny and disinformation to deliver, for example, gendered disinformation targeting women journalists is significant. With regards to generative AI, of course, this is an important trend to discuss. I think sometimes we need to be cautious about how much emphasis we're putting on generative AI without paying ongoing attention to the kinds of harms that exist in the Web 2.0 environment, for example. That said, what generative AI has the capacity to do, and we're already starting to see this, is to create more believable, disinformation-laced content designed to harass and abuse and imperil women journalists, and to do so at a greater scale, more quickly, and as I say, with more believability associated with this. So what it means is the kinds of threats that include deep fakes, targeting women journalists online, which is a trend we have seen across the 8 big data case studies we've produced and talk about in this book. Those become both much more challenging to combat because it's more difficult to convince an audience that journalist A is not in fact conducting a secret life as a porn star, which is endangering her in her community, particularly if she's living in a conservative society. And one of the big trends that we have detected through our research over the past 6 or 7 years is the use of the term and the hashtag and associated memes, prostitute, which for me still sums up the great challenge that we face at the intersection of misogyny and anti-media sentiment. And that all looks so much worse when you combine it with racism and religious bigotry, which is frequently the situation facing women journalists, this sort of intersectional online violence. Thanks for your question, Hannah.
Thank you very much, Julie. Do we have somebody else? I see there is a hand behind. Yes.
I just would like to kindly ask to show this QR code again.
The QR code is here on this little flyer, so I encourage you to come here and pick it up at the end of the session. And yeah, it's a QR code for the toolbox and the monitoring guidelines, but also in relation to AI it's a very topical matter. We also have a project on the impact of artificial intelligence on freedom of expression. So here there's also a QR code on that, and you can explore the resources there in that regard. Yes, please.
Hi, Annette Young from France 24. This is a question for all of you, but primarily for Julie. How much interest is there from media organisations in what you are doing? And can you give us a sense of the timeline of your project?
Sure. So this book that the OSCE has published is a part of a bigger project which Annette's referring to, which is the Online Violence Alert and Response System project. We have very significant interest from news organisations, large and small, internationally, and that's because the platforms, for example, are not doing the kind of monitoring that needs to be done specifically in an increased threat environment such as an election year of this magnitude, and with sort of parallel threats to democracy more broadly. What we need, though, is for these big, obscenely wealthy tech companies to contribute to the process of developing the technologies, but also to introduce the same kinds of monitoring systems within their companies, so that it's possible for us to do two things: to escalate to them when a woman journalist, or any journalist for that matter, is attacked online to an extent that we have significant concerns about escalation to offline harm. And secondly, because fundamentally they need to do much more quickly to stem the tide of the kinds of abusive, harassing, attacking behaviours that are exposing particularly women journalists to much greater risks.
And media organisations, news outlets in particular, who's expressing interest?
Well, as I said, many international news organisations, large and small, are interested in this system. They are recognising increasingly that they have to monitor the digital threats to journalists, and in parallel with those digital threats, of course, are the psychological harms that Hannah's drawn attention to, but the great physical risks that are associated with escalating online violence, for example. So there is an increased awareness of more sort of holistic approaches being necessary, and greater monitoring being necessary, but we still have so far to go. And as I've alluded to, it's not going to be possible to properly address this crisis without the investment of these large companies that frankly facilitate and enable the kinds of environments that lead to the rollback of gender rights, which include the facilitation of increased misogynistic attacks on women journalists.
Thank you very much. We just have 3 more minutes. Is there a final question? Very brief. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm a female freelance journalist, and I've been threatened on Instagram, particularly I've been covering wars, whether in Ukraine or Middle East, and I've been threatened with rape, murder, beheading, and all sort of things. And every time I try to report to the very first platform, the very platform that I've been threatened on, which is Instagram, very often they just deny my request. And if they do keep going with the request, I mean, it's just like anonymous people, and they create other accounts. How do you work with these platforms and social media to actually improve that, if you can?
I mean, I'm sorry. Do you want to take that, Renate, or are you happy for me to?
No, I think there are two things. One is, yes, we have problems with the platforms. We do have also now the Digital Service Act, and there are also ways to deal with the platforms, with trusted flaggers who also report when there are problems, and you're absolutely right, it's not enough. But I think what is important is you as a freelance, you need a support group, be it a journalist organization, be it even as a freelance, you work for clients. So for us, and that's also half a response to what you said, there is employer's duty of care. We talk about the employer's duty of care when we send journalists to war zones, but likewise, employers need a duty of care when it comes to online harassment of their journalists, and also giving mental health and all that. We are in discussions with them, but it's a very difficult issue.
Thank you very much, Renate and Julie. I'm afraid we have to end the session here. And thank you all for coming and for listening.
And can I just say we have 4 or 5 copies of this book. If you want a hard copy, feel free to come and take one.